A beer killed 11 people in Brazil. The same chemical crippled 50,000 Americans and paralyzed 10,000 people in Morocco. It wasn't poison. It was never supposed to be in food.
Everything is connected. Nothing is random.
There's a moment, a single moment when your body stops obeying you. Your foot won't lift. Your hand won't close. In 1930, a farmer in Oklahoma woke up and couldn't walk to his barn. In 1959, a school teacher in Meknes collapsed in front of her students. In 2020, a father in Belo Horizonte kissed his daughter goodnight and never woke up. 3 continents, 3 generations, 3 completely different lives. They never met. They never spoke. They never knew each other's names. But they all drank the same thing. Not water, not milk, not alcohol, something else. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. This is not a story about a virus. This is not a story about a poisoner. This is a story about what happens when machines and mouths share the same chemistry, and how for nearly a century we kept making the same mistake. Over and over and over. The pattern was always there, hidden in hospital records, buried in autopsy reports, written in the trembling hands of survivors who could never explain what happened to them. These cases should never have been connected, but they were, and the connection changes everything. Chapter 1. The First Outbreak. Oklahoma, March 1930. Thomas Bennett was a railroad worker, 42 years old, strong enough to lift steel beams, reliable enough to support a wife and 3 children during the worst economic collapse in American history. He woke up on a Tuesday morning and his legs wouldn't move. Not paralyzed, not numb, just disconnected. He could feel them. He could feel the bed sheets. But when his brain said stand, his legs said nothing. His wife found him on the bedroom floor 20 minutes later. She thought he'd had a stroke. The doctor who came to the house thought it was polio. But Thomas Bennett wasn't the only one. By the end of that week, 17 people in his town couldn't walk. By the end of the month, the number was in the hundreds. Across Oklahoma, across Kansas, across Tennessee and Mississippi and Georgia, thousands of Americans suddenly crippled. They called it Jake Leg, a shuffling, foot-slapping walk that marked you as one of the afflicted. The victims were almost exclusively poor, almost exclusively rural, almost exclusively male, and almost all of them were liars. Because this was 1930, the height of prohibition, and everyone who got Jake Leg had been drinking something they weren't supposed to: Jamaica ginger extract. Jake, as it was known on the streets. A brown liquid sold in small bottles at pharmacies and general stores. Legally, it was medicine, an herbal remedy for stomach ailments, a tonic containing ginger root, water, and alcohol. 70 to 80% alcohol. The law said you could sell it. The law didn't say you could drink it to get drunk, but everyone did. Because during Prohibition, if you wanted alcohol and couldn't afford a bootlegger, Jake was your only option. It tasted like battery acid mixed with dirt, but it worked. And it was legal, except the government knew what people were doing. So they created a test, a density test. If a bottle of Jamaica ginger didn't have enough solid ginger residue, it would be flagged as too watery, too obviously just alcohol for drinking. The manufacturers needed a solution. They needed something that would make the liquid heavier, something that would pass the test, something cheap. They found it. A compound used in industrial plastics. A clear, oily substance that mixed perfectly with alcohol. It had no taste. It had no smell. It added exactly the right weight. And it was toxic. Profoundly, irreversibly toxic. Thomas Bennett never knew what he drank. He bought his bottles from a traveling salesman who came through town every few weeks. The label said Jamaica ginger extract. The label said for medicinal use only. The label didn't say anything about triorthocresyl phosphate. It didn't say anything about neurotoxins. It didn't say that every sip was destroying the insulation around his nerve fibers. By the time investigators traced the outbreak to contaminated batches of Jake, more than 50,000 Americans had been affected. Some lost the use of their hands. Some lost the use of their legs. Some lost both. The damage was permanent. The nerve cells didn't regenerate. The manufacturers were never criminally charged. They claimed they didn't know the additive was dangerous. They claimed they were just trying to meet government standards. They paid small fines. They closed their factories, and the victims were left to drag their feet for the rest of their lives. Thomas Bennett died in 1947. He never walked normally again. His death certificate listed complications from paralysis of unknown origin. But by then, everyone had moved on. The case was closed. The bottles were destroyed. The chemical had a name now, TOCP, and the medical community filed it away as a historical curiosity. A lesson learned. A mistake that would never be repeated. They were wrong. Chapter 2. The second incident. Meknes, Morocco, August 1959. But Morocco revealed something investigators had missed in 1930. Fatima Bouslam was 28 years old. A school teacher in a provincial city 4 hours from Casablanca. She lived with her parents and her younger sister. Every morning, she walked to the market to buy fresh bread and vegetables. Every afternoon, she taught children to read and write in French and Arabic. She was careful. She was healthy. She had no reason to think anything was wrong. On a Thursday in late August, she bought a liter of cooking oil from a new vendor. The bottle was unlabeled. The oil was pale yellow. The price was half what she usually paid. The vendor said it was overstock from a European supplier. Premium quality. She bought 2 bottles. That night, she used the oil to fry fish. The next morning, she couldn't get out of bed. Her legs felt heavy. Her hands tingled. By noon, she couldn't stand. By evening, she couldn't move her fingers. Her father carried her to the hospital. The doctors had no idea what they were looking at. Paralysis without fever. Paralysis without infection. Paralysis without injury. And she wasn't the only one. By the end of the week, the hospital in Meknes had admitted 63 patients with identical symptoms. By the end of the month, the number was over 10,000. Across multiple cities, across multiple provinces, all of them paralyzed, all of them previously healthy, all of them recent purchasers of cheap cooking oil. The Moroccan government panicked. This wasn't a disease. This was too fast, too coordinated, too deliberate. Authorities suspected sabotage, foreign agents, contaminated water supplies, biological warfare. Investigators tested grain shipments. They tested municipal water. They tested flour, rice, sugar, tea. They found nothing. The victims kept arriving. Young men who could no longer work. Young women who could no longer walk. Children whose hands curled into permanent claws. It took 6 weeks to identify the source. The cooking oil, sold by traveling merchants, bought from a distributor in Casablanca, who had bought it from a supplier in Tangier, who had bought it from a man who never gave his name. The oil wasn't cooking oil. It was lubricant, engine lubricant, aviation engine lubricant. After World War II, the United States had vast stockpiles of surplus military equipment, vehicles, aircraft, fuel, lubricants. Much of it was sold off cheaply to foreign buyers. Some of it was legally exported. Some of it disappeared. Barrels of jet engine oil, high-performance lubricant designed to withstand extreme temperatures. It contained additives, anti-wear compounds, heat stabilizers, and a neurotoxin called triorthocressyl phosphate, TOC, the same chemical that had crippled 50,000 Americans in 1930. Someone had bought the barrels, and through illegal resale channels, the lubricant later entered food markets, where it was sold as cooking oil, because the liquid was clear, because it looked like vegetable oil, because it was cheap, and because no one tested it. Fatima Bouslam survived, but she never taught again. Her hands never regained their coordination. Her legs never regained their strength. She spent the rest of her life in a wheelchair, watching her younger sister raise children she would never have. She died in 1991. Her death certificate listed complications from paralysis of unknown origin. The man who sold the oil was never found. The distributor claimed ignorance. The supplier had no records. And the Moroccan government quietly archived the case as accidental contamination. No international investigation was launched. No warnings were issued to other countries. The medical community filed it away as a regional tragedy. A terrible accident. A mistake that would never be repeated. They were wrong, and investigators would soon discover this wasn't history repeating itself. It was happening again. Chapter 3. The Modern Case. Belo Horizonte, Brazil, January 2020. The brewery was called Belo Horizontina, a craft operation in a wealthy neighborhood. Exposed brick walls, Edison bulbs, reclaimed wood tables, the kind of place where every beer had a story and every bartender had a beard. They specialized in IPAs, sours, experimental brews with mango and passion fruit. They had won awards. They had a waiting list for weekend reservations. They were successful. On a Saturday night in early January, 32 people drank beer at Belo Horizontina. On Sunday morning, 11 of them woke up feeling sick, nausea, dizziness, muscle weakness. They thought it was a hangover. By Monday, 4 of them were in the hospital. By Tuesday, 1 of them was dead. Lucas Mendes was 34 years old, a graphic designer, married, no children yet, but they were trying. He'd gone to the brewery with friends from work. He'd ordered a flight of 4 beers. He'd laughed. He'd taken photos for Instagram. He'd gone home and kissed his wife goodnight. 18 hours later, his kidneys stopped working. The doctors didn't understand. His blood work showed catastrophic organ failure. His liver enzymes were off the charts. His kidneys were shutting down. His nervous system was misfiring. But there was no infection, no virus, no bacteria, just shut down. And he wasn't the only one. By Wednesday, 7 people were hospitalized. By Thursday, 3 more were dead. All of them had been at Belo Horizontina. All of them had drunk the same beer, a limited edition IPA called Golden Horizon. The health department shut down the brewery immediately. They tested everything: the beer, the water supply, the grain, the hops, the yeast. They looked for bacterial contamination: Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria. They found nothing. Investigators questioned the owners. Had anyone threatened them? Had they received any suspicious deliveries? Had any disgruntled employees been fired recently? The answers were all no. But people were dying, and no one knew why. The breakthrough came from a toxicologist at the state university. She had seen cases like this before, not in food, in industrial accidents, workers exposed to coolant leaks, mechanics who ingested antifreeze. The symptoms matched. She requested a specific test: diethylene glycol, DE, a sweet-tasting liquid used in antifreeze and industrial cooling systems. Highly toxic when ingested, causes kidney failure, causes liver failure, causes death. The beer tested positive. High concentrations, lethal concentrations. But how? The brewery didn't use antifreeze. They didn't store industrial chemicals. They brewed beer. The answer was in the cooling system. Belo Horizontina used a glycol chiller to cool the beer during fermentation. A closed-loop system. The glycol ran through coils submerged in the fermentation tanks. The glycol never touched the beer, except when it did. One of the cooling coils had developed a microscopic crack. Investigators later discovered the fissure during a detailed equipment inspection. The crack was barely visible, but it was enough. The glycol had been leaking into the beer for weeks, slowly, invisibly, and because diethylene glycol is sweet, no one tasted it. Lucas Mendes died on January 9, 2020. His wife was 2 months pregnant. She didn't know yet. His death certificate listed acute renal failure due to toxic ingestion. The brewery never reopened. The owners were not criminally charged. Engineers later concluded the equipment failure resulted from normal wear and improper maintenance schedules. The case was filed as accidental contamination, and the world moved on. Chapter 4. The pattern emerges. 3 tragedies, 3 eras, 3 continents. On the surface, they have nothing in common. One involved illegal alcohol during Prohibition. One involved cooking oil in post-colonial North Africa. One involved craft beer in modern Brazil. Different products, different countries, different decades. But the symptoms were identical: paralysis, organ failure, sudden collapse of bodily systems that had worked perfectly the day before. The victims were healthy. They weren't sick. They weren't elderly. They weren't weak. And then, suddenly, they were. Medical investigators in each case initially suspected infectious disease, polio, botulism, an unknown pathogen. But there was no fever, no inflammation, no immune response, just damage, direct chemical damage. In each case, authorities suspected deliberate poisoning, sabotage, terrorism, revenge. Because how else could so many people be affected so quickly? But there was no perpetrator, no motive, no confession, just an accident, a terrible, preventable accident. And in each case, the victims shared one thing. They had consumed something that was supposed to be safe: medicine, food, drink, products they trusted, products they bought legally, products that passed every visible inspection, until they didn't. The connection isn't obvious at first. Jamaica ginger extract, aviation lubricant, brewery coolant. They don't seem related, but they are, because they all contain the same thing: industrial chemicals. Chemicals designed for machines, not mouths. Triorthocresyl phosphate, to, a plasticizer, an anti-wear additive, a flame retardant, used in hydraulic fluids, used in jet engine oil, used in industrial lubricants. It makes machines run smoothly. It destroys human nerve cells. Diethylene glycol, DEG, an antifreeze, a coolant, a solvent, used in brake fluid, used in cooling systems, used in industrial heat exchangers. It prevents machines from freezing. It causes human kidneys to fail. These chemicals are everywhere: in factories, in warehouses, in supply chains, sitting in barrels next to food-grade products, flowing through pipes next to drinking water, separated by a single valve, a single seal, a single decision. And when that separation fails, when someone cuts a corner, when someone doesn't check, when someone assumes it's safe because it looks safe, the chemicals don't care. They don't distinguish between a machine and a body. They just do what they're designed to do: dissolve, lubricate, stabilize, destroy. The pattern is this: industries create chemicals for industrial purposes. Those chemicals are cheap. Those chemicals are effective. And those chemicals end up where they shouldn't be. Not because of evil, not because of conspiracy, but because of economics, because of negligence, because of the assumption that if something is legal to manufacture, it must be safe to store next to food. In 1930, manufacturers added TOCP to pass a government test. In 1959, suppliers sold TOCP-laced lubricant as cooking oil because it was profitable. In 2020, a cracked cooling coil allowed DEG to leak into beer because inspections were expensive. Different motives, same result. The victims never knew. They couldn't taste it. They couldn't smell it. They couldn't see it. The chemicals were invisible, and by the time the symptoms appeared, it was too late. The damage was done. The nerves were dead. The organs were failing. And in every case, the response was the same: shock, investigation, identification, closure. File it away. Label it as accidental. promise it won't happen again, and move on. But it did happen again. It happened in 1930. It happened in 1959. It happened in 2020. And it's happening right now. Somewhere. In a factory you've never heard of. In a supply chain you'll never see. In a product you'll buy next week. Chapter 5. The Hidden Link. The link between these cases isn't a person. It isn't a conspiracy. It isn't a cover-up. The link is a system that prioritizes efficiency over safety, a system that assumes separation is enough, a system that only investigates after people die. Records later indicated that the manufacturers of Jamaica ginger knew TOCP was used in industrial applications, but they didn't test it for human toxicity. They assumed the dose was too small to matter. They assumed their customers would survive. They assumed wrong. Evidence suggested that suppliers in Morocco knew the oil barrels were labeled not for human consumption. But they also knew that cooking oil sold for twice the price of lubricant. They assumed no one would check. They assumed no one would notice. They assumed wrong. Investigators later concluded that the brewery in Belo Horizonte knew the cooling system required regular maintenance. But they also knew inspections were expensive. They assumed the system would hold. They assumed the seals were intact. They assumed wrong. The chemical industry produces thousands of compounds every year. Most of them are safe when used correctly. Most of them are labeled clearly. Most of them never come into contact with food or drink. Most of them. But the infrastructure that separates industrial chemicals from consumer products isn't a wall. It's a line. A regulatory line. A legal line. A line drawn on paper. And when profit margins shrink, when inspections are delayed, when shortcuts are taken, that line disappears. Authorities discovered that in the Jake leg epidemic, the contaminated batches were distributed across 18 states. The bottles looked identical to the safe ones. The labels were the same. The seals were intact. There was no way for a consumer to know. No way to test it at home. No way to protect yourself. You just drank it and hoped. Authorities discovered that in the Moroccan outbreak, the lubricant oil was stored in repurposed vegetable oil containers. The barrels had been cleaned. The labels had been replaced. The liquid looked right, felt right, smelled right, until it killed you. Authorities discovered that in the Brazilian brewery case, the cooling system had been inspected 6 months prior. The inspector found no visible issues. The seals looked intact. The pressure readings were normal. The crack was microscopic, and microscopic was enough. The connection between these cases is this. Industrial chemicals designed for machines will always be cheaper and more efficient than natural alternatives. And wherever there is a cost difference, there is an incentive. An incentive to substitute. An incentive to cut corners. An incentive to assume it will be fine. The human body cannot process organophosphates the way it processes food. It cannot filter glycol compounds the way it filters alcohol. These chemicals bypass every natural defense. They attack nerves directly. They shut down kidneys immediately. They don't give you time to realize what's happening. By the time you feel sick, the damage is permanent. And the terrifying part? We only know about these cases because enough people died at once. 50,000 in the United States, 10,000 in Morocco, 11 in Brazil. Enough to trigger investigations, enough to make headlines, enough to demand answers. But what about the cases where only 5 people died? What about the cases where only 1 person died? What about the cases where the victim recovered but never knew why they got sick? Those cases don't make the news. Those cases don't get investigated. Those cases get labeled as unexplained illness and filed away forever. Medical researchers later estimated that for every documented case of TOCP poisoning, there were likely dozens of undocumented exposures. People who experienced partial paralysis, people who recovered slowly, people who assumed they'd had a stroke or a virus or just bad luck, people who never connected their illness to what they ate or drank. Because why would they? The products were legal. The labels were approved. The companies were legitimate. Everything looked safe. Until it wasn't. This is the hidden link. Not a chemical. Not a company. Not a conspiracy. The link is trust. We trust that food is food. We trust that medicine is medicine. We trust that the systems designed to protect us are actually protecting us. And most of the time, they are. Most of the time. But when those systems fail, when inspections are skipped, when regulations are ignored, when profit is prioritized over safety, the chemicals don't care. They don't care about your trust. They don't care about your assumptions. They just do what they're designed to do. And your body pays the price. The revelation. Let's return to the beginning. Thomas Bennett, the railroad worker in Oklahoma. Fatima Bouslam, the school teacher in Morocco. Lucas Mendes, the graphic designer in Brazil. They never met. They never spoke. They never knew each other existed. But they all experienced the same thing. They woke up one morning feeling fine. They went about their day. They consumed a product they trusted. And within hours, their bodies began to shut down. Not because of bacteria, not because of a virus, not because of anything natural, because of chemistry. Industrial chemistry. Chemistry designed for machines. The Jake leg epidemic lasted for months before anyone identified the source. By then, 50,000 people had been poisoned. The Moroccan outbreak lasted for weeks. By then, 10,000 people were paralyzed. The Brazilian case lasted for days. By then, 11 people were dead. The response time improved. The technology improved. But the fundamental problem never changed. We have not solved this. We have not eliminated the risk. We have simply gotten better at responding after it happens. After people die. After the damage is done. After the lawsuits are filed. After the headlines fade. There are currently over 80,000 industrial chemicals registered for use in the United States alone. Most of them are safe when used correctly. Most of them are stored properly. Most of them never come into contact with food or water. Most of them, but not all. And the infrastructure that separates those chemicals from your dinner table? It's the same infrastructure that failed in 1930. The same infrastructure that failed in 1959. The same infrastructure that failed in 2020. Regulations, inspections, trust, and the assumption that everyone will follow the rules. Investigators have documented at least 27 separate contamination events involving glycol compounds since 1930. Some were large, most were small, some were in developed nations. Most were in countries with weaker regulatory systems, but all of them shared the same pattern. Industrial chemicals, food or medicine, economic incentive, preventable tragedy. In 1985, diethylene glycol contaminated wine in Austria. In 1990, it contaminated cough syrup in Nigeria. In 1996, it contaminated children's medicine in Haiti. In 2006, it contaminated toothpaste in Panama. In 2007, it contaminated cough syrup in Panama. In 2008, it contaminated milk in China. Different products, different countries, same chemical, same result. The pattern repeats. Because the incentive never changes. Industrial chemicals are cheaper. Industrial chemicals are more efficient. And as long as there's a cost difference, someone, somewhere, will make the substitution. Will take the risk. Will assume it will be fine. Until it isn't. Thomas Bennett's grandchildren are still alive. Some of them still live in Oklahoma. They drink beer. They take medicine. They eat food from factories they've never seen. And they trust that it's safe. Because what else can they do? Fatima Bouslam's sister is still alive. She lives in Meknes. She cooks with oil from the supermarket. She doesn't think about 1,959. She doesn't think about barrels of lubricant sold as food. She just cooks and trusts. Lucas Mendes's daughter was born in September 2020. She'll never meet her father. She'll never know that he died because a cooling coil cracked. She'll grow up. She'll drink beer. She'll trust that it's safe, because what else can she do? Lasting impact. The connection between these cases isn't hidden. It's documented. It's in medical journals. It's in regulatory reports. It's in the archives of every public health agency in the world. But it's not taught. It's not discussed. It's not part of the conversation. Because to acknowledge it would be to acknowledge something uncomfortable, that the line between food and poison is thinner than we think, that the systems designed to protect us are only as strong as the weakest inspection, that the products we trust are only as safe as the corners that weren't cut, and that sometimes those corners are cut anyway. You've probably consumed an industrial chemical this week, not because of contamination, not because of negligence, but because it's legal. Emulsifiers, stabilizers, preservatives, compounds with names you can't pronounce, designed in labs, tested for safety, approved by regulators, and added to your food because they work. Most of them are safe. Most of them, but we only find out which ones aren't after people start dying. After the investigations, after the lawsuits, after the regulations are updated, after the damage is done. This isn't a story about the past. This is a story about now. About the beer you drank last weekend. About the medicine in your cabinet. About the cooking oil in your kitchen. About the invisible line between safe and deadly, and how easily that line disappears. Thomas Bennett couldn't walk. Fatima Bouslam couldn't teach. Lucas Mendez couldn't wake up. They trusted. They consumed. They died or were crippled. Not because they were careless, but because someone else was. The pattern is clear. The connection is undeniable. The chemicals are still there. Still in factories. Still in supply chains. Still one valve, one seal, one decision away from your dinner table. And the only thing standing between you and them is trust. The question isn't whether it will happen again. The question is when, and whether you'll be the one drinking.